And welcome everyone to this Lexology Masterclass on PFAS in Consumer Products, a multi-state compliance guide. My name is Lynn Bergeson. I'm managing partner of Bergeson and Campbell, located here in Washington, D.C. We are a law firm that focuses on chemical law, chemical science, chemical regulation, and litigation. I am totally thrilled to be joined today by two of my colleagues here at Bergeson and Campbell, Dr. Lindsay Holden, who is senior toxicologist and a regulatory scientist, and Carla Hutton, senior regulatory analyst. You will be receiving, after this presentation today, fuller biographical statements, a copy of the slides, and a very helpful Q&A document that will record the answers to the questions that we anticipate receiving during this webinar. And finally, a very helpful list of resources that will help you as you navigate your way through this incredible maze of federal, state, and international PFAS regulation. You know, we all do a great deal of PFAS work here at Bergeson and Campbell at the international, federal, and state level. Dr. Holden assesses many different issues from a scientific perspective. Carla spends more time than any of us on these issues. She has an absolutely encyclopedic understanding of, in particular, the differences between and among emerging state PFAS restrictions and labeling requirements and product restrictions. So we're thrilled to have who we affectionately refer to as the Queen of PFAS on this webinar today. In terms of our agenda, we're going to first hear from Dr. Holden, who will talk about PFAS from kind of a toxicological and chemical perspective, because in order to understand some of the definitional disarray that really permeates this space, you need to understand what a PFAS is and isn't, and how different jurisdictions define PFAS, which is added to a lot of the complexity, confusion, apprehension, if not terror, in compliance with this area of the law. Then we're going to move into PFAS requirements at the state level, reporting, labeling, and product prohibitions. Carla will be handling that because she knows the space inside and out. Then it will revert back to me to talk about federal PFAS reporting that hasn't actually yet started yet under TSCA, but is poised to do so soon, on also some international restrictions under the EU REACH PFAS proposal, which also hasn't yet started, but has been a work in progress now since 2023. And then we're going to talk about key takeaways, messages that we hope you all glean from this webinar and get you thinking about how best to satisfy these requirements in a holistic, comprehensive, and compliant way. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Lindsay Holden.
Thank you, Lynn. As an introduction, let's start by considering what are PFAS. Simply put, per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances are substances with fluorinated carbons. The example PFAS that I have here on this slide is perfluorooctanoic acid, PFOA, PFOA. The tail, which is hydrophobic, has a chain of 8 carbon atoms, so it is a C8 PFAS. Generally, the shorter the carbon chain, the less biologically sticky the PFAS is, meaning that the body can process and clear any internal PFAS. The longer chain PFAS, including C8 PFOA, may bioaccumulate to the extent that they may cause adverse health outcomes. So the head is hydrophilic, and in this PFOA example is carboxylic acid, COOH. This example PFOA is a linear PFAS, and there are also branched PFAS and other structures that impact how PFAS are eliminated from internal circulation, which directly affects their health hazard potential. So in general, linear PFAS have longer biological half-lives than branched PFAS, meaning they take longer for organisms to eliminate. And a major challenge with regulating PFAS is the broad and shifting definitions that Lynn alluded to that are applied across a very complex family of substances, the PFAS. So words matter here. Different types of PFAS have different properties. Their size, stability, mobility in the environment, ability to bind to proteins, etc. These properties inform which PFAS may be a higher priority in terms of potential toxicity, exposure, and bioaccumulation. And one of the simplest distinctions among the major groups of PFAS is non-polymeric and polymeric PFAS. So polymeric PFAS or fluoropolymers are a distinct group of PFAS with a unique combination of properties and should be really considered separately. As we'll go into in later slides, some jurisdictions are taking that approach, although not in a very coherent way. And my call to action here to this audience is that casual use of the term PFAS when you're actually talking about a specific small molecule, maybe a non-polymeric PFAS like PFOA, PFOS, PFHXS, one of the many PFAS, it creates confusion. We have ample evidence of toxicological hazard for only a small subset of PFAS. So lumping all PFAS into a single category results in this general belief by the lay audience that all PFAS are bad or dangerous, which is just not accurate. Next slide, please. There's a fairly long history at this point of how the chemical community has defined PFAS. The most recent and foundational definitions in the United States and the EU are summarized in this table, and these definitions are all structure-based. The OECD defines PFAS as a substance that contains aliphatic and saturated CF2s or CF3s. The aliphatic means that it's the carbon backbone, either linear or branched. It's linear or branched. It's not a benzene ring. And this is a pretty broad definition. As you can see, the count of substances that each of these definitions encompasses exceeds 30 or 38,000 different substances. In 2022, the EPA established a definition of PFAS for the Safe Water Drinking Act Contaminant Candidate List, the CCL, which authorizes EPA to collect data on the substances listed therein in drinking water to form a basis on the scope of potential drinking water contamination for substances that are currently not regulated and to determine how prevalent that may be. So on the CCL, EPA defines PFAS as a category with a more narrow scope than OECD, where there are limitations on the R groups, so those hydrophilic tails, and also hydrophobic tails rather, and also established a requirement for at least two fluorinated carbons within. It has three defined structures there. So the EPA Safe Drinking Water Act definition narrows the scope down to 10,000-ish PFAS. And then there are currently 29 individual PFAS that are being monitored in drinking water under the fifth unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, which is what is the operationalized CCL list. Then in 2023, the EU defined PFAS under the REACH restriction proposal as containing at least one fully fluorinated methyl CF3 or methylene CF2 without any hydrogens, chlorines, bromines, or iodines attached to it, and quote with few exceptions, unquote. So that's not vague and ambiguous at all. Sarcasm. The REACH definition it's similarly narrowed in relation to the OECD definition, similar to EPA's Safe Drinking Water Act definition, but it's narrowed in a slightly different way. So there's a lot of different definitions, which is confusing. And this REACH PFAS restriction proposal is still in the process of being finalized, but is anticipated to be final by the end of 2026. I think we'll hear a little bit more about that from Lynn later on. Also in 2023, EPA defined PFAS for the TSCA Section 8 reporting and record keeping rule, which is similar to the Safe Water Drinking Act definition, but different, slightly expanded to include additional allowances for what can be on those R groups, those N groups. And again, these are all structural definitions. They are not a list of CASP registry numbers. So from an implementation standpoint, this is really challenging because you can't just go to your list of here are all the CAS RNs that are, in my product or my value chain. Rather, you need to work with a chemist to go through that list and identify anything that meets these structural definitions. The next slide, please. For individual state definitions of PFAS, which is, the majority focus of this talk, there are two main definitions that are being propagated right now. One was established by New Mexico, picked up by Minnesota, other established by West Virginia and picked up by Delaware, where New Mexico defines per and polyfluoral alkyl substances as a substance containing a fluorinated organic chemical containing at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom. So very broad definition of PFAS, broader even than the OECD definition. In New Mexico, all you need is one fully fluorinated carbon atom to be considered a PFAS. My interpretation of the intent of this definition is to leave no PFAS behind. Got to catch them all, regardless of intrinsic physicochemical properties and any inherent hazard. This definition is being adopted more broadly across states, so not just New Mexico and Minnesota. Seems like this is uh, becoming a little more popular. And then the states individually may define carve outs or exclusions from that definition. So, for example, fluoropolymers. West Virginia, on the other hand, has defined PFAS as non-polymeric with two fully fluorinated carbons, excluding gases and volatile liquids. So this definition is much narrower than EPA's definitions under Safe Drinking Water Act or TSCA Section 8A reporting rule. And my interpretation of the intent of this definition is to exclude classes of PFAS with physicochemical properties that have low potential for health hazard, such as the large size of fluoropolymers and their inherent lack of bioactivity, and classes such as F gases, which are regulated by Clean Air Act. So these are two very different definitions across states. If you have a product that is manufactured, distributed across states, you really need to tailor your definition of PFAS and how you report those PFAS to states that may require reporting or labeling. And the challenge is to consider, your PFAS management strategy on regional, national, and international level across all of these definitions and determine how best to manage your current and future obligations. Next slide, please. To expand upon the confusing and diverse definitions and classes of substances that fall within PFAS, I have an example here of different PFAS that are binned into different categories, including on the top in the yellow there is the perfluoroalkyl acids and their ether acids and precursors. So PFOA and PFOS fall under this category and are the two most well-known, well-established hazardous PFAS substances. Similarly, HFPODA, so Gen X, and the 6,2-FTOH fall into this category. Depending on size and side change, these, generically fall into a surfactant type category. They've been used as stain and water repellent coatings, legacy aqueous film forming foams, so the firefighting foams, and may be used in as building blocks for other fluoropolymers. Down in the gray section are examples of such as PTFE, which examples of fluoropolymers such as PTFE, which is what gives your nonstick pan the slippery nonstick coating. It's also used for seals and gaskets, and other fluoropolymers are used in battery binders, membranes, wire insulation, chemical resistant tubing, wire coating. So think like broadly electrical applications. And then the perfluoropolyethers, PFPEs, are used in lubricants and oils that are stable under really high temperature and may be used in aerospace nuclear applications, oxygen-rich or corrosive environments, including in medical applications. So these uses are dependent really on the inherent stable properties of PFAS, which also makes PFAS generally stable in the environment. There's all sorts of other types of PFAS that may fall into the very broad definition of PFAS, including the few examples given in the blue section. that may be used for medical imaging applications, specialty refrigerants and fluids, other types of heat transfer fluids. So the point here is that this is a large, broad category, and state regulations, federal regulations, international regulations are going to impact so many different types of businesses with so many types of products and services. So it makes guidance and implementation by regulators very difficult and really puts the onus on the regulated entity. So you, the producer, to manage all of this. Next slide, please. All right. So why are PFAS being regulated? If you didn't know, um, first, over the last 2 decades, it has become apparent that PFAS are extremely widely used across a diverse set of applications that I gave a few examples of in the previous slide. But there's still a lack of transparency as to where and how PFAS are used, especially within complex products. And there are well-established concerns about the hazard of a subset of well-studied PFAS, um, largely based on the intrinsic physicochemical properties of each PFAS, including environmental half-life, water solubility, mobility in the environment, boiling point, vapor pressure, so their physical state. And then, finally, really the slow pace of federal regulations paired with high public concern has resulted in individual states developing their own regulations to protect consumers and the environment. And that's where we are right now. Next slide, please. And before I hand this over to Carla to go in depth on the developing state regulations for PFAS, I'm going to describe some definitions of key vocabulary terms that you'll be hearing throughout the remainder of the talk. So, intentionally added PFAS means deliberately added or used during the manufacture of a product, where the continued presence at any level or concentration of the PFAS substance is desired or expected in the final product or one of the product's components. So, key there is desired or expected in the final product. Consumer is an individual, partnership, corporation, state agency, or subdivision of an agency of the state who seeks or acquires by purchase or lease any goods or service. So fairly broad. Currently unavoidable use is PFAS substance that the state regulatory board, has determined by rule to be essential for health, safety, or the functioning of society for which alternatives are not reasonably available. So, not your countertop coffee pot that may have PFAS in a component for the convenience of your morning cup of joe, but rather think about medical devices, other public health services. That's the type of currently unavoidable use that's important for health, safety, and functioning of society. And each CUU must be individually applied for. There's a lot of uncertainty about how determinations will be made by the state. A manufacturer is a person, a firm, an association, a partnership, a corporation, organization, or a combo of those that creates, produces, or assembles a product, or whose brand name is affixed to a product. So if you purchase the product, put your brand name on it, you are a manufacturer. And then if you import the product into the US, the importer or first domestic distributor of the product is also a manufacturer, as long as the whoever made it does not have an office or employees in the US. Product means an item created, produced, assembled, packaged, or otherwise prepared for sale to a customer, including a product component sold or distributed for either personal, residential, commercial, or industrial use, or for use in making a product. So product is the product itself or the bits and bobs that go into it. And then finally, I've got two different types of fluorine detection methods listed here: total organic fluorine, TOF, and total fluorine, TF, where total organic fluorine is looking for fluorine carbon bonds. It uses a detection method specific for that bond. And total fluorine is looking for all fluorine in a sample. Total fluorine is specific to Washington State only, but both methods do not identify individual PFAS, but rather just a generic fluorine content. So with those definitions, I'm going to hand this off to Carla to start breaking down what's happening across the states. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Lindsay. States may use one, all, or some combination of prohibitions, reporting, and labeling requirements to regulate PFAS. States typically target certain consumer products first. These categories are carpets, cleaning products, cookware, cosmetics, dental floss, fabric treatments, juvenile products, menstruation products, textile articles, ski wax, and upholstered furniture. Because these are it- sort of the first line of products targeted, I think often we've seen clients not realize that they will be captured under later regulations because they don't manufacture products like this. Um, so, although consumer is pretty much anyone that uses a product, including industry, for this webinar, I'm going to refer to these as certain consumer products. But as Lindsay noted, consumers, everybody. Connecticut is an example of a state that is prohibiting PFAS only in certain consumer products. Maine, Minnesota, and New Mexico will broadly prohibit PFAS in 2032, but initially, these three, these three states have or will prohibit PFAS in these same certain consumer products first. Sticking with Connecticut, beginning this July, July 1, it will require notification and labeling for PFAS present in certain consumer products. Aside from apparel, Maine and Minnesota have already banned PFAS in the consumer products at issue, so I don't think Connecticut will receive many notices. At this time, it's April, Connecticut has not yet posted information on how notices can be submitted, and I think that indicates that Connecticut doesn't expect to receive much. Meanwhile, on July 1, 2026, reports on products containing intentionally added PFAS are due in Minnesota. This is a broad reporting requirement and applies to almost everything. New Mexico's statute also includes a reporting requirement with reports due January 1, 2027, but New Mexico's statute includes some exemptions that Minnesota does not. Maine, which was the first state to enact a broad reporting requirement, amended its statute so that only the PFAS in products with CUU determinations have to be reported. As I stated, Connecticut's labeling requirement will apply only to certain consumer products. And again, with the exception of apparel, Maine and Minnesota have already banned PFAS in these products. New Mexico is in the process of preparing a final rule that includes a broad labeling requirement that will apply to most products manufactured after January 1, 2027. Next slide. If you sell or distribute products that contain intentionally added PFAS in Minnesota, you must report certain information by July 1. The statute defines manufacturer as the person that creates or produces a product or whose brand name is affixed to the product. Reports are required for pretty much all products except for pesticides, firefighting foam, and food packaging, which are specifically addressed elsewhere in the Minnesota statutes. The information reported must be specific enough that consumers will understand where the PFAS are located within the product. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, or MPCA, uses the example of a car radio. The radio could have a printed circuit board, a protective film screen, and wire coating that all contain PFAS. Reporting radio printed circuit board or radio wire coatings with details for each PFAS will allow consumers to understand where and why the PFAS are used versus reporting car radio. Minnesota's regulation defines component to include packaging when the packaging is, quote, inseparable or integral to the final product's containment, dispensing, or preservation, end quote. According to MPCA, packaging that is incidental to transport, display, or marketing, such as cardboard backings, shrink wrap, or shipping containers, is not considered a component and is not subject to reporting. Minnesota's reporting rule allows the grouping of similar products, a group of manufacturers to report together, and reporting a range of PFAS concentrations. If manufacturers in the same supply chain enter into an agreement, each manufacturer needs to maintain documentation of the agreement. Next slide. I would like to apologize in advance if anyone from Bose is here, but within a few months, this sort of information will be available for all reported products. Minnesota opened up its reporting portal on January 30th, 2026, and there are already reports from several companies, including Bose, available. As companies submit reports, MPCA will make the information available online. As of yesterday afternoon, information on 2,986 items was publicly available. While almost 3,000 quote unquote items sounds like a lot, information is reported to Minnesota at the component level for the function of each PFAS that is present within a product. So almost 3,000 items visible in the database is not the same as having information available for 3,000 different products on the market in Minnesota. In this case, I grabbed just a portion of the information reported for Bose Quiet Comfort Ultra Headphones second generation. In line 1, Bose could report only that PFAS is present, but the specific PFAS, its function, and the range are all unknown. I assume this is because the supplier or the supplier's supplier could not or has not provided more detail. Lines 2 and 3 report the same PFAS, but with different functions and in different amounts, so I think the PFAS is present in different components. Same in lines 4 and 5, where the component and PFAS are the same, but the function and reported range are different. Reports are due July 1, 2026. Minnesota's regulation includes a provision to request a waiver, but the request must include a description of the publicly available records that contain substantially equivalent information available elsewhere. MPCA intended to post a reporting waiver request form in late March, but as far as I know, it is not yet available. Since Minnesota is the first state to require reporting, as far as I know, the level of detail required by Minnesota is not available anywhere else. So I would be very surprised if any company successfully obtained a waiver. The regulation also allows for an extension of the reporting deadline. Extension requests are due at least 30 days before the due date and must include documentation demonstrating that the extension is justified. If approved, MPCA will grant a one-time 90-day extension. The reporting portal is on the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse website, and it allows users to download the full data set using the API, Application Programming Interface. Registration is not required to view or download the data. Users can select company or brand names and export the results of their searches to Excel or CSV. Next slide. Turning to New Mexico, the good news and the bad news is that shortly after Minnesota's July 1, 2026 reporting deadline, reports are due in New Mexico by January 1, 2027. This is a statutory deadline. Under the statute, the reportable information is the same as that required in Minnesota: a description of the product, the purpose for which the PFAS is used in the product, the amount of PFAS in the product, and contact information for the manufacturer. The statute provides the New Mexico Environment Department, or NMED, the authority to grant a waiver if substantially equivalent information is publicly available. It also allows New Mexico to enter into an agreement with other states to collect information or accept information from a shared system. Since Minnesota built its reporting platform on the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse's high priority chemicals data system, I expect New Mexico to do something similar. Next slide. There are some key differences between Minnesota and New Mexico's statutes, however. New Mexico exempts several products completely from the reporting and prohibition requirements. Some of these are already regulated at the federal level, such as medical devices, drugs, and packaging regulated by FDA, veterinary products regulated by FDA, USDA, or EPA, motor vehicles, next slide, watercraft, semiconductors, products used for the generation, distribution, or storage of electricity, and products containing fluoropolymers. While at least, next slide, while at least some industry breathed a sigh of relief, these exemptions, and the fluoropolymer exemption in particular, will be under review. The New Mexico legislature passed a resolution in January requesting that EnMed prepare a report on the risks of the exemptions and provide recommendations to the legislature regarding whether the exemptions, and specifically the exemption for fluoropolymers, should be continued, modified, or removed. The preliminary findings are due December 1, 2026, and the final report is due August 1, 2027. Next slide. Beginning January 1, 2025, Minnesota banned intentionally added PFAS in carpets, cleaning products, cookware, cosmetics, dental floss, fabric treatments, juvenile products, menstruation products, textile furnishings, ski wax, and upholstered furniture. Minnesota's statute explicitly prohibited the determination that the use of PFAS in these product categories is a CUU. New Mexico will accept CUU proposals for some of these same consumer products. CUU proposals for these products in New Mexico are due October 1 or October 31, 2026. Another difference between New Mexico and Minnesota is the definition of intentionally added. Lindsay gave a broad definition. Unfortunately, a lot of the states each add their own very minor amendment that can be enough to change the meaning of the definition. So Minnesota's definition includes that the continued presence of PFAS is desired in the final product or one of the product's components to perform a specific function. This means if PFAS are present in the product as a result of contamination or as a byproduct, then the continued presence is not desired. And under Minnesota's definition, PFAS are not intentionally added. New Mexico's definition of intentionally added requires that PFAS expected in the final product be reported. So PFAS byproducts and contaminants that are expected must be reported in New Mexico. New Mexico also requires that PFAS used during the manufacturing process be reported. This could be as a mold release agent, while Minnesota does not if the presence of the PFAS is not intended in the final product. I hope that New Mexico will accept information reported to Minnesota. As I noted earlier, Minnesota is releasing all data not claimed as trade secret. But the issue of whether New Mexico will require manufacturers to report byproducts and contaminants not reported in Minnesota remains to be seen. I suspect that New Mexico regulators will interpret that as a substantial difference, but at this time, there's no guidance available. Next slide. New Mexico released a proposed rule in October 2025 that included a broad labeling requirement beginning January 1, 2027. EdMed modified the proposed rule twice in January and February of this year in advance of an administrative rulemaking hearing held by the New Mexico Environmental Improvement Board. While the label proposed in October would have required a caution that PFAS are associated with environmental impacts and health effects such as cancer, as well as a link to EnMed's website for more information, EnMed dropped the required caution and URL before the hearing. I don't think that I've ever said this about a hearing in my career, but New Mexico's hearing was riveting. Objections because questions called for a legal conclusion from toxicologists. Fluoropolymers often seem to be on trial. Anyone looking for more information on PFAS should review the docket materials. And if you have the time, the multi-day hearing is available on YouTube. Next slide. The January and February versions of New Mexico's proposed rule exempt pesticides, medical devices, and medical packaging regulated by FDA from the labeling requirement. Otherwise, for products that are exempt from the reporting and prohibition requirements, NMED may waive the labeling obligation if none of the product's material containing intentionally added PFAS will ever come in direct contact with a consumer while the product is being used as intended during the useful life of the product. Industry proposed extending the reporting and prohibition exemptions to the labeling requirement, and the board rejected the proposal. The board also rejected a proposal to postpone the labeling requirement to January 1, 2028. NMED did revise its October proposal so that the labeling requirement will apply to products manufactured after January 1, 2027. We still don't have a final rule. NMED intends to issue one by July 1, 2026. Next slide. The next few slides include a roundup of state requirements taking effect between now and January 1, 2028. This is not intended to be an exhaustive list, and with many state legislatures still in session, requirements might be enacted now that would fall within this time frame. I touched on these first few requirements, but New Hampshire is also in there. It will ban intentionally added PFAS in certain consumer products as of January 1, 2027. Next slide. CUU proposals for prohibitions taking effect in New Mexico in 2028 are due January 1, 2027. New York will ban PFAS in apparel above a restriction level that has yet to be set. New York already bans intentionally added PFAS in apparel, but I believe this restriction level is intended to eliminate PFAS byproducts or contaminants in apparel. Washington now has a reporting requirement for PFAS in certain products, and reports for 2026 are due January 1, 2027. Washington will also ban intentionally added PFAS in certain products. Next slide. Reporting in Minnesota will be an annual requirement, and the next round of reports are due February 1, 2027. This date reflects the statutory deadline for the initial reports that would have been due January 1, 2026. Beginning January 1, 2028, another round of prohibitions will take effect in New Mexico. State requirements don't exist in a vacuum. So Lynn will now provide an overview of the federal reporting requirement in the United States and a proposed restriction in the EU. Next slide.
Thank you, Carla. That was wonderful. I'll now turn to the federal PFAS reporting obligation. There is a final rule in place that would prompt a one and done federal reporting obligation for all PFAS as defined under the rule. It was issued 2.5 years ago on October the 11th, 2023, and it's derivative of a requirement in the fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. So it was not a consequence of an amendment to TSCA. It was an add-on to TSCA derivative of the 2020 fiscal year NDAA. Through a series of extensions, the reporting window has not yet begun. And in fact, as recently as yesterday, EPA issued yet another extension starting the reporting period on January 31, 2027, or, and we'll talk more about this, 60 days after the effective date of a final rule expected to be issued later this year. Okay. Next slide. The current PFAS reporting rule, the one that was issued in final in October of 2023, is very aggressive. Again, the reporting period for this final rule under the current PFAS restriction does not begin until January 31, 2027, or 60 days from the issuance of the final rule that we expect later this year. Under the current rule, there are virtually no exemptions from reporting. As many of you know, under TSCA Section 8A, there are traditional exemptions from reporting for byproducts and impurities and articles, in particular, research and development chemicals. When the final rule came out in October of 2023, we were all chagrined, to use one word, disappointed to use another, that the rule excluded none of those, which put an enormous reporting burden on entities, and in particular, importers of finished products, otherwise known as articles. So the cost burden of that rule was expected to be almost $1 billion, 845 million to be exact, which would have imposed a reporting burden, according to OMB, of $41,152 on manufacturers of PFAS and $11,003 on importers of PFAS embedded in articles. So under the current rule, none of those exemptions applies, and the reporting obligation, albeit one and done, for a look-back period beginning in 2011 through 2022, was quite literally enormous. Next slide. When the Trump administration took office, one of its priorities was to eliminate rules that would have an inordinate burden on business, and also rules that had a limited ability to elicit meaningful regulatory and toxicological information. So last October, November 13th to be exact, oh, I said October. Last November, November 13th to be exact, EPA proposed extensive modifications to the final rule. And under the final or the proposed rule that would significantly amend the rule that is now in place, more of the traditional TSCA Section 8 exemptions would apply. So there would be exemptions for imported articles, byproducts, impurities, R&D substances, non-isolated intermediates, and most importantly, a new exemption for de minimis. So imported articles or other products that contain less than 0.1% concentration of PFAS would be entirely exempt. And the reason for that is EPA reasoned that back in the 2011 to 2022 reporting range, there were virtually no reporting obligations for PFAS, which means it would have been very difficult to speculate as to whether or not PFAS would be in products, and at trivial levels like 0.1%, the agency has more recently concluded that that should be exempt from reporting. So that rule was proposed last November. The comment period closed December 29th, 2025. EPA is reviewing those comments. It is, in my view, I think the view of this firm, that it is more likely than not that that rule will be issued largely unchanged in final. The question is when, because you need to be mindful that although the current reporting window opens up on January 31, 2027, do not burn that in your mind as being the date that you don't have to worry about anything before. The reason being that when the final rule, the final revised federal PFAS reporting rule is issued in final, which could be as early as June, but I doubt. I think EPA has made some references to perhaps a June issuance date, but that's fast approaching. But let's assume it comes out in October or November, then 60 days from that date, if that is sooner than January 31, 2027, that will be when the reporting period opens. So can't tell you more about when the rule will be issued in final, but I do believe it's going to look a whole lot like the proposed rule, which obviously is good news, given everything that Carla just went through in terms of the complexity and the granularity and the visibility and the impending nature of these state reporting obligations. All of a sudden, the federal reporting obligation takes on a much different meaning and is seemingly less burdensome, but nonetheless important. So let's take it to the next slide, and I'm going to be very brief talking about some of the EU REACH PFAS restrictions. Next slide. I don't want you to get the impression that the United States and the European Union under REACH are the only jurisdictions focusing on PFAS restriction, because there are PFAS restrictions in place in China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada has an emerging program. So virtually all sophisticated state, federal, excuse me, international jurisdictions maintain PFAS restrictions. I'm focusing on the PFAS restriction in Europe under REACH because it is very influential with regard to US regulation, and it is a very large market for US industry shipping products over into the EU. But bottom line, a comprehensive, very comprehensive PFAS restriction proposal was issued in 2023. It was derivative of the competent authority recommendations from Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. It would purport to ban pretty much all PFAS, defined very broadly, and as Lindsay indicated, much more broadly than the US definition and more akin to state definitions of PFAS across all sectors. There was a proposal issued last August that offered different restriction options. They are a full ban, a ban with time-limited derogations for certain applications. And the third RO or restriction option was continued use allowed under very strict conditions that would minimize, if not eliminate, exposures to people. So there is considerable process afforded in the European Union under REACH. And ECHA, the European Chemical Agency's Risk Assessment Committee, otherwise known as RAC, and its Socioeconomic Analysis Committee, SEAC, must evaluate the rule, the revised rule, and all the comments to ensure that they are scientifically complete and can be defended. Next slide. So where are we at right now? We know that the final RAC was issued last month. Comments on the draft SEAC opinion are due next month on May 25. SEAC expects to adopt its final opinion, and as I said, RAC already has, by the end of 2026. After that, the European Commission and member states will review, and following a council and parliament review, will adopt and begin enforcing PFAS restrictions in Europe under REACH sometime in the 2027 timeframe or later, depending upon how things go. So it's an evolving program. It's an important program. If you have any downtime at all, take a look at the RAC, the Risk Assessment Committee final opinion, because it's very interesting. There is much more information available on the European program and other programs, including the Canadian PFAS program, available at our PFAS News and Information Center. And some of the links that we will share with you after this webinar, along with the slides to this webinar, because some of you have asked, do you get the slides? Yes, you do. You will be provided much more information on these very important developments. We've gone through this slide deck very quickly. There's a lot of information here, but we also have as much information and much, much more at our PFAS News and Information Center. So with that, Carl, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about our takeaway messages from this webinar.
Thanks, Lynn. I know we've covered a lot of ground today, but we do want to leave you with some key takeaways. Although certain products, such as medical devices, are exempt from TSCA, those exemptions do not apply to state restrictions. Manufacturers need to check each state's requirements. States consider industry to be manufacturers and consumers. State reporting, prohibition, and labeling requirements may apply depending on the product and the state. To date, the enacted state reporting requirements allow states to share information, and the information required under the statutes is very similar, if not identical. Reports are due July 1, 2026 in Minnesota, and that information is already, as it's being reported, available online. State requirements are similar, again, not identical. So while Maine, Minnesota, and New Mexico will broadly ban intentionally added PFAS in 2032, Maine and New Mexico have some exemptions that Minnesota does not. And even Maine and New Mexico don't have identical exemptions. New Mexico is notable for exempting products containing fluoropolymers from its reporting and prohibition requirements. Maine requires reporting only for products with CUU determinations. How can you meet this jumble of reporting, labeling, and prohibition requirements? Lindsay will have some suggestions. Next slide.
All right, thank you, Carla. So, round two key takeaways here is you really need to work on developing a comprehensive PFAS reporting strategy to ensure that you understand, how you are defined. Are you a manufacturer? Where your products are distributed? Where they're ending up? There's all these details that vary across states and vary at the federal level as well. So, as you develop that reporting strategy, you should consider the legal and optical implications. So legal, what are you required to do? And the optical implications, Carla showed us an example of already publicly visible information reported by a manufacturer that's now out there in the public space. So thinking about how and when you'll be reporting any required information. Federal and state reporting requirements should be harmonized as best as possible. The federal reporting requirements, it's a look back period, so it's retroactive, what has occurred in the past. State reporting is current and forward looking, but you're reaching out to your supply chain to help determine if and how much PFAS are in your products. And so if you're able to consolidate that ask, it will reduce the burden on you as you consolidate that information. International reporting requirements should also be considered. Is that your market or your intended future market? And how are you going to manage that along with your domestic responsibilities? And consistent communications are really key and essential within your team, to your supply value chain, to your users, the consumers of your products, and then monitoring regulations that are actively changing at the state level that will be forthcoming, state and federal, as well as monitoring your supply chain, because as additional regulations go into place, supply chains are going to be perturbed. And so what is, in a product may change over time, and it's part of your responsibility and your due diligence to be monitoring that. So with that, I mean, next slide, I think I'll hand it back over to you, Lynn.
Thank you, Lindsay. We have a lot of questions, and before anybody, leaves, because we have a very limited period of time within which to answer them, we are recording every question. We will answer every question, and we will send written responses to every question along with the meeting materials of this webinar, because we know how important answering questions can be. And so we are going to begin that now, and what we can't get to, we will follow up in writing. So first question is, with state level restrictions and reporting requirements, if a company does not have a presence in a state with reporting requirements, who reports on the company's products sold in that state? There is no importer concept in interstate commerce, is there? Carly, want to take a shot at that?
Sure. And actually, I think Minnesota looks at it as an example that yes, either the company that introduces the product would be considered the importer, or they're going to look to the brand name on the product. So in this case, I think we would advise our clients, if that's your brand name, ultimately, for better or worse, it's going to come back on you about whether the PFAS are they reported accurately? So it's awful. It's a complicated template requiring a lot of detailed information that likely is not readily available, but get in there and report.
Thank you, Carla. I've got one more for you, and then I'm going to pivot to Lindsay. And this question comes up a lot. Terminology is very confusing. are professional and industrial products, not consumer products, out of scope of consumer product requirements for reporting and labeling? Carla?
I mean, unfortunately, they're not. And this
Right.
is confusing. I mean, medical devices, the PFAS in them needs to be reported to Minnesota. I don't think there's really anything that's out of scope unless it's addressed under a separate statute in Minnesota. So, yeah, we have unfortunately broken this bad news to clients and will probably continue to have to do so, that you either are a manufacturer or you are a consumer and are subject to reporting.
Carla, that question comes up all the time in a variety of contexts. That you call your product a professional product, will not shield you from reporting obligations. So just be mindful that it's how the state defines these categories, not how you define your product. Lindsay, this one is for you. Does a single fluorine on a tertiary carbon count as fully, I think it's as fully, not at fully, fluorinated carbon atom per New Mexico and Minnesota?
So that's a good question. So the idea here is a lot of the PFAS definitions say that you need to have a fully fluorinated carbon, and then it specifies that it's a carbon with two fluorines that's attached to other carbons, or a carbon with three fluorines, kind of at the end of a chain or something like that. And so this question is on that tertiary carbon. So essentially, the carbon molecules got other carbons on it or other substances, and then a fluorine hanging off. So it's just one fluorine. And the the New Mexico definition doesn't say one way or the other. It just says fully fluorinated carbon. I think the general definition would say that it would not count, but I'm not a lawyer, so I think that is yet to be determined. But that's the exact type of question that these changing definitions that sometimes can be vague leaves open on the floor. Are we capturing everything correctly? So.
And we use an expression here at the firm, BYOC, bring your own chemist to some of these decision-making questions, because that's a very good question and it could vary under state law. Next question is, most of the reporting requirements are tied to manufacturers or importers, correct? I think certainly at the federal level, that would be right. It would be the import of neat PFAS and the manufacture of PFAS, not use, or articles that are imported containing PFAS. But Carla, that's not correct at the state level.
Right. Minnesota, distribution's prohibited. So what does that mean if you've got a product that you didn't make it, but you're distributing it? Or um, I don't think Minnesota intends to hit retailers in the same way that Prop 65 does, with reporting or with labeling, that the burden for reporting, New Mexico, the burden for labeling, retailers are not or should not be part of it, but retailers at the same time need to be aware. Uh, and we've seen, I think, some retailers querying, the products being sold. Certainly, a lot of retailers have their own either green lists or prohibited to phase out of their available products. So mostly,
Right. Thanks, Carla. Well, we are officially out of time. For all of you who asked questions and we have not had an opportunity to respond, don't despair. We will respond to each of them in writing and distribute them to you, certainly this week, but probably not today. Please take a look at all the resources we have available online for free. Lots and lots of information. We're sending you a specific list of references that will help you along with the biographical statements of the presenters and, of course, the slide and recording of it. So you can expect to receive all that. Our thanks to Lexology, my co-presenters, and you, the audience, for asking such terrific questions, which we do promise to get to and respond to each of them. So thank you all very much. Thanks, Carla. Thanks, Lindsay. Great job.